Well, as we continue our discussion of 19th century philosophy, we're going to add now a third stream or a third road that flows out of Hume and Kant, a different way of reacting to them. We have looked at the rationalist response in Hegel. We've looked at the non-cognitivist responses of voluntarism, romanticism, subjective individualism, and finally nihilism. Both of those have proven to be a very sad dead end in various ways. You don't really get the truth, and in the end you end up with a broken human nature, and there are no truths. In fact, for Nietzsche, the truth isn't even important anymore. Is that what Western culture has come to? Well, the reason why now in the late 20th century this may have surprised you that 19th century philosophy had these sorts of problems is because we are in, if you will, the more Anglo-American side of Western culture and its development. And what I'm going to be putting on the board now is the third response to Hume and Kant is something that you'll identify with a great deal more, and it's what I'll call the road of secularism. And now that I have that on the board, let me tell you that earlier when I was illustrating the three responses to Hume and Kant, what I am now calling secularism, I labeled phenomenalism. Phenomenalism. The reason why I did that is because the philosophers we're now going to be looking at, they denied the phenomenal-noumenal distinction of Kant. There is no thing in itself or ultimate reality beyond the appearances to our senses. And the reason why I have diagrammed things in the particular physical configuration you see here on the board is that I want you to see that secularism and rationalism have that in common, that there is no thing in itself. Hegel denied the thing in itself. And he said through the process of history, ultimate reality is manifesting itself. The secularists that we're now going to study, they too deny the idea that there's a thing in itself. And they too have what amounts to a process view of history. Where does that come to? Classic expression, Darwinian evolution. And so there's an interesting parallel here. Even though the secularists despised the rational theorizing of Hegel, found it ridiculous, full of pomp and circumstance, saying nothing. On the other side of Hegel, you have the non-cognitivists. They agree with Hegel that we can be in touch with ultimate reality. Hegel says you do it through your reasoning process. The non-cognitivists don't agree with that. It's not through reasoning that we're in touch with reality, but through blind irrational will, our emotions, our commitments, ultimately our will to power. Maybe I'm just too tired here and I think too highly of this, but I think if you master this diagram, you'll understand the 19th century. The non-cognitivist route, the rationalist route, and now we're going to begin talking about secularism, where metaphysics is replaced by the philosophy of history, by sociology, and by psychology. Where metaphysics is replaced by the philosophy of history, sociology, and psychology. And a note on psychology, we could have an entire week of lectures just on the development of psychology and its crucial place and function in the development of modern culture. You know, the study of Freud and thereafter. But I'm a philosopher, not a psychologist, and we don't have a whole lot of time, as you know, so all I am going to tell you is remember that though psychology is one of these things replacing metaphysics, I'm not going to say a whole lot more about that. But it's a huge domain. Just think about all of the effects on movies, on the way people write, on the way they think of themselves, on the court system, on and on and on, of the development of psychology. Well, that's part of the secularist route of the 19th century. Metaphysics replaced by the philosophy of history, by sociology and psychology. If you will, the secularism of which I'm speaking amounts to scientism and social reform. Scientism and social reform. There were, in the 19th century, some developments that practically ignored Kant in his psychologizing of reason and science. Developments that didn't pay attention to how Kant had mitigated confidence in reason and science by psychologizing it, and didn't answer his critical challenge. And I mean critical here both in the mundane sense, but also in the technical sense. His is the philosophy of criticism. There were developments in the 19th century that practically ignored Kant's psychologizing of reason and science, didn't answer his critical challenge, but more or less continued in a direct and naive fashion the Enlightenment's confident attitude toward reason. Not pure reason, as Kant tried to criticize it in his critique of pure reason, but continued a naive, confident attitude toward reason as it's guided by empirical methods. Now, depending on where you're coming from, what I've just said is either a great insult or it's a great compliment. The people who were secularists of the 19th century, if I point out, it's like, had you been listening, you haven't answered Kant, you've got a big problem on your hands. They say, there's no problem. You know, that's a great compliment to us, that we haven't been sidetracked by these German, nutcases like Kant. We have better things to do than that. But from where I'm coming from as a teacher of philosophy, and especially the history of philosophy, I think it's rather naive when Kant has done this devastating work to just kind of close your eyes and just continue with Enlightenment confidence and reason. Nevertheless, these secular developments shared Kant's negative attitude toward metaphysics. They didn't share his negative attitude toward science and reason or empirical reasoning, but they did share his negative attitude toward knowing reality in itself, ultimate reality, metaphysics. But they were more anti-metaphysical than Kant. Make sure you note that. They shared his negative attitude, but they upped the ante quite a bit. Because you may remember, Kant said, we can't know anything about it, but there is a thing in itself. There is a noumenal realm. The secularists that I'm speaking of rejected things in themselves altogether. They were phenomenalists. That's why I used that term earlier. They were phenomenalists. Everything that we know is phenomena. There is no noumena. Kant said there is a noumena. We don't know anything more about it than that. These people said, just drop it altogether. There is no noumena. They were anti-metaphysical with a vengeance. And so their attention shifts. Well, wait, before I say that, I want to note that they were not just going beyond Kant in saying that there is no metaphysics, no noumena. Quite contrary to Hegel as well, they were indifferent and sometimes hostile to the idea of systems. The one thing you have to give Hegel credit for is he had a grand idea of a system of thought. Everything would fit into his system one way or another. All the accumulation of knowledge of the ages and all logic and so forth. Well, these secularists were quite indifferent, in many cases disrespectful to the idea of system. They derogated notions of theory as being speculative. They derogated the drive for coherence, where everything is brought together and integrated. They were more in favor of the positive data of empirical experience. I want you, even though we haven't talked about positivism yet, I want you to have a feel for this, that instead of systems and theories that bring everything together, what's important is just the positive data. All ideas, to the secularists that we're going to talk about, all ideas tend to be an ideology that you should suspect. And ideas should not be evaluated as to whether they are ultimately true, ultimately false. In the end, they should be interpreted and evaluated as to their consequences. Who does that sound like? Who do we just study? Nietzsche. Nietzsche came to this through a different, window, to be sure. But Nietzsche ends up saying, what's important is not truth and error, but consequences. Whether a statement is instrumental to accomplish your ends. Well, they were not nihilists in the full-blown Nietzsche sense. I mean, he had a boldness to go all the way with this. But they did believe that, if you will, metaphysical truth is not what's important. Don't worry about theories. Don't worry about systems of thought. You worry about positive data and the consequences of the positive data. And that will lead to, we're going to talk about this in the 20th century division, that will lead to pragmatism ultimately. So, 5 implications of this secular mentality that I've been trying to generalize and describe for you. First of all, the secularists that we're going to be looking at shift their attention from a static view of the universe to a view of the universe that is developing through time. The 19th century secular outlook puts a great emphasis on the historical perspective, the developmental genetic perspective, where things come from, how they've developed, because everything is developing. The universe is not just static objects and eternal truths, after all. Secondly, in my generalization about 19th century secularism, you'll see that life and ethics must become practically oriented. Practically oriented. Not only historically oriented, but practically. What is valuable is not motives, like Kant said, the purity of a man's will. What's valuable are consequences. And so, for instance, the utilitarians don't want to talk about abstract rights. They want to talk about what actually brings social reform, what makes people happy. It's the outcome that counts, not the theory that leads to it. Thirdly, the secularists shift away from traditional questions in metaphysics and epistemology. As I've just said, they were anti-system, they were anti-theory, and their shift is to social philosophy. In particular, a shift to a scientific treatment of nature and society. The reason why I'm calling this secularism is because it emphasizes the here and now studied apart from revelation, apart from religion, and apart from all speculation. Systems of philosophy are derogated as ideologies. The new secular man is going to address his environment and himself in a scientific way. By the way, just as an aside, to give you some feedback, as I'm watching you taking notes and so forth, you understand this without any problem. You're not having any difficulty with this, because this is the zeitgeist, this is the spirit of the age in which you have grown up. You don't agree with it, but you're not having, there's no Hegelian nonsense in this. Yeah, that's right, that's what we're dealing with. Isn't that amazing? It shows, where we come from, and also shows that when I gave you my promise, I wasn't lying, that after Hegel it all gets easier. Well, back to my notes. First, a shift from the static view of the universe to a developing view, historical perspective. Secondly, a practical perspective that looks at consequences, not motives and theories and so forth. Third, a shift away from the traditional philosophical questions of metaphysics and theory of knowledge, and a shift towards social philosophy. And so we have a great deal of 19th century interest in reform, or in the case of Marx, revolution. Reform and revolution become primary philosophical of primary philosophical interest to these secularists. The new secular man is going to address his environment. He's going to look at nature and society and himself apart from revelation, apart from religion, apart from philosophical speculation. He's going to be scientific. Here's the secular man. Fourthly, 19th century secularism is characterized by what might be called scientism, the view that there are settled laws that can simply answer all philosophical problems. If we would just empirically study our environment, we would find those iron laws of reality, and in terms of them, all philosophical problems can be answered. The secularists optimistically thought they could apply empirical methods to solve the grave social problems of man. That in fact there is unlimited progress possible for man through the power of his knowing, through the power of knowledge. You all understand that, right? I'm getting ahead of myself, but think about American education. Why is American education the great messiah for us? Because if we would just apply the power of knowing, be empirical, down to earth, we'd be able to solve our social problems. Illegitimacy and drugs and war and poverty would go away. Like I say, how's it going? How's it working out here in this optimistic secular approach to solving things? If we could just empirically get to the laws of science, then we'd be able to solve our problems. Yeah, right. Number 5, the emphasis in 19th century secularism is that man is part of nature. Man is no longer the image of God, closer to the angels, if you will. Man is no longer even philosophically special because he's the reasoning animal. But man is simply a natural object. He's part of nature. His body, his activities, and even his mind can be scientifically studied. We use the genetic model. Where did man's thinking come from genetically? Where does his behavior come from genetically? And so man is now seen as part of nature. And what this leads to is 3 things: evolution, psychology, and sociology in the 19th century. Evolutionary view of man, the development of psychological study of man, and the alleged science of sociology. All right, so these remarks have been intended to introduce the 3rd major stream of 19th century philosophy. We have non-cognitivism over on one side here as a response to Hume and Kant, rationalism, another response to Kant and Hume, and now secularism with its scientific and its sociological orientation. If you look at your lecture outline, you know that what's coming now, the next school of thought that we're going to look at, is called British Utilitarianism. The British utilitarians naively accepted an empirical approach to knowledge and what's called psychological associationism. The way in which the mind of man works is by means of association of ideas affecting one another. They naively accepted empiricism and psychological associationism and felt that social theory should no longer be based on, quote-unquote, eternal verities. The language of eternal verities is Locke's. And who do you know, what culture or nation inherited Locke's notion of eternal verities? The United States of America, of course. We enshrined that in the Declaration of Independence. There are what? Inalienable rights that nature and nature's God. Now that's Lockean in its outlook. The utilitarians, now what have I already said, are suspicious of what? System, theory, abstract notions. The utilitarians say social theory shouldn't be based on Locke's eternal verities or anybody else's eternal verities. It shouldn't be based on eternal verities, but only those principles that can be proved empirically. Social theory needs to be guided by principles that are empirically provable. Okay, and we're going to look at two utilitarians. First, Jeremy Bentham, and then John Stuart Mill. All right, the first British utilitarian, Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832. Bentham was the son of a wealthy attorney. He studied Latin when he was 3 years old, graduated from Oxford when he was 15 years old. He went and studied law. He never practiced law. He wrote on legal theory. In terms of British culture, you should know that he was the founder of the Westminster Review in the year 1824. He wrote The Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789. And based on it, developed an elaborate scheme for prison reform in England. Bentham was the leader of a reform group that called themselves the Philosophical Radicals. Bentham advocated the view that a legislator's guiding aim should be the principle of, quote, general utility, and that only. That is, the legislator should consider the general utility of legislation, its usefulness, and that's all you should consider. Is the secular mindset evident immediately here? No abstract theories, not a question of eternal verities or rights, no divine revelation, none of that gobbledygook of the philosophers and theologians. The usefulness of a piece of legislation is the only thing that counts. According to Bentham, moral good is such, quote, only on account of its tendency to secure physical benefits. Moral good is such only on account of its tendency to secure physical benefits. And he said that the principle of utility takes as its starting point in all reasoning, quote, the calculus or comparative estimate of pains and pleasures. I want you to get that quote because that, in a sense, typifies this mentality. The calculus or comparative estimate of pains and pleasures. You look at physical benefit, pains and pleasures, what's physical, and you do a calculus on it. And I'll give it to you even better, another quote. He said, we must discover some calculus or process of moral arithmetic by which we may arrive at uniform results. You know, my flesh is crawling here as a philosopher now. Moral arithmetic. That's his expression. You might think that's what I might say, you know, to, in a sense, give a characterization, to put it down. But that's what he said. We do moral arithmetic. quote, legislation may thus become a mere matter of arithmetic, he said. A mere matter of arithmetic. His utilitarianism has often been called the greatest happiness principle. The greatest happiness principle. Our moral decisions and our legislation should be based on the principle that we seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Bentham is the founder of the utilitarian outlook, but it was a follower of him who more thoroughly developed this outlook, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. John Stuart Mill enjoyed a precocious education that was designed by his father and his father's friend, Jeremy Bentham. Mill was studying Greek at age 3, and by the age of 8, he had read all of Plato in the original. It's overwhelming, really. You think about that. He had read Plato in the original by the age of 8. In 1822, John Stuart Mill entered India House and quickly rose to be head of the office. You have to understand British ways there. To use the American equivalent, he became the undersecretary when he was just a young man. He wrote a great deal on logic, on economics, parliamentary reform, and women's rights. John Stuart Mill is politically correct. He was an extensive supporter of women's rights. He served briefly in Parliament from 1865 to 1868. One of the books he wrote was The Principles of Political Economy, published in 1848. The Principles of Political Economy. Another aspect of his life that may be about as fascinating as that he read Plato by the time he was 8 is that Mill credited one Mrs. Harriet Taylor for his intellectual achievements. He was a longtime friend of Mrs. Taylor, and after her husband died, Mill married her in 1852. Watch your imaginations, just rein them in now. But the interesting thing is somebody of the stature of Mill is the 19th century supreme proponent of empiricism. He had great stature as an intellect, as a logician, as an administrator, a parliamentary reformer, and so forth, and he was willing to give this woman credit, he said, for his intellectual achievements. Interesting. I'm going to work backwards, in a sense, in showing you his philosophy. I'm going to talk first, real briefly, about his religious views, then about his epistemology, but then his utilitarianism, the reason why we brought him up today. First, on religion, he wrote in 1874 3 essays on religion in which the very interesting, unique thesis is propounded that God is benevolent but limited in power. God is benevolent, but God is limited in power. And the reason for that is that if you look at the world round about you, you have evil. And if God were completely powerful, he'd be able to undo that evil. Or if you say that he's able to undo that evil and he doesn't do it, then he's not benevolent. He's sort of sadistic. And so Mill was willing to say, well, God, whatever God may be, he tended, I think, toward the view that humanity is God, but whatever God is a good being, benevolent, but not an all-powerful or sovereign being. Yes?
You said he wrote that in 1874?
Well, it was published in 1874.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. If he wrote it after he was dead, we should really pay attention to what he was saying. Sorry about that. Unless I have it wrong in my notes, but I'm assuming that must be the date of publication. Now, as to his theory of knowledge, John Stuart Mill was empirical and inductive in his approach. Empirical and inductive in his approach. He was a supporter of Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, indeed wrote a book entitled Auguste Comte and Positivism, 1865. He did not share Comte's view of social engineering. We're going to be looking at Comte pretty soon. He didn't share that. He was more of a libertarian in his approach, but he did share Comte's positivism, empiricism, and inductive reasoning. In fact, in Mill's, perhaps the book that made him famous originally, his System of Logic, a 2-volume work in 1843, Mill looks at the limits of meaningful discourse. He's anticipating 20th century concerns here. He says, the only meaningful discourse is one where all the terms in it reduce to terms that deal with the sensible effect of properties. The sensible, by that capital touch, you can, by observation and experience, note those effects. So he's quite empirical. He reduces everything that's meaningful down to the empirical posits. He held that all logic is reduced to inductive generalization. That is, Mill ultimately didn't believe that the deductive principles of logic were in fact absolute and universal. They were inductive generalizations. And in the System of Logic, he delineated 4 methods of experimental inquiry. 4 methods of experimental inquiry, and laid out canons for determining causation. Those of you who have studied logic with me will understand immediately what I'm referring to. The rest of you say, what's this all about? Deductive reasoning has rules that we follow, and as I already told you, Mill thought they could be reduced to inductive. Inductive reasoning looks at experiences, gathers data, and when you're going to draw a causal conclusion that certain things cause other things, you need to have types of correlation that will prove that point inductively, not prove it with absolute certainty. But what generally do we conclude is the cause of malaria? Well, we don't see causation of malaria, do we? It's not like you can watch it. It's like a billiard ball, around a table. This gets this and then ends up in the pocket. Here's where malaria comes from. We rather have all these kinds of experiences in the world, right? And so we have people who come in and they have experiences of these symptoms. And then you start finding out what's true of all these people besides those symptoms. And you have to check and cross-check and so forth. Like, what if people, forget malaria for a minute, what if you had a group of people scattered in various places in the country, and they all come up with this strange intestinal situation, this parasite that you can find that, makes them, vomit and lose weight and be dehydrated and almost die. And you want to know, well, what caused this parasite? How did this come about? Well, you do your research and you find out that it's, that all these people, or not all of them, but the larger percentage of these people had all been in a particular city a particular weekend. Well, all of that's just data, right? You haven't got any causation yet. But what if you find out that people, that no one else is reported to have this except people who were in that city? And then you go further and you discover that these people who were in that city that weekend either stayed at or visited with people who stayed in a particular hotel. Okay, and now I'm not giving a real sophisticated illustration, but what I'm getting at is, you see, you got to collect data, and inductive reasoning helps you to do these, cross checks and comparisons, associations, and so forth. Then you finally get to the place where you say, well, it would appear that there was something maybe in the water or maybe out of the kitchen in this hotel that infected these people, and they talked to other people who were infected, and that's how we account for it, so now we know what caused it. That is the course of modern science. Well, Mill was the one in 1843 who tried to systematize the methods of experimental inquiry and develop what we call inductive logic. All right, so Mill is known for a rather unique view in religion. He's known for the development of inductive logic and the empirical criterion of meaningfulness in the use of our language. But he comes to our attention today primarily for his best-known essay entitled On Liberty, 1859. On Liberty. Now, I'm assuming that as educated people, all of you have read that. If you have not read that, I'm not assigning it, I'm not going to follow up on it, but that is one of the classic, philosophical and literary productions of Anglo-American culture. Everyone should read Mill on Liberty, 1859. This essay is a defense of human rights, free speech, free association, those sorts of things. A defense of rights not by abstract principles, nature and nature's God. He doesn't appeal to anything abstract. He appeals to what? Utilitarian consequences. And according to Mill, we should be left free to do as we wish, quote, so long as what we do does not harm our fellow creatures. We should be left free to do what we wish as long as what we do does not harm our fellow creatures. And this he supported by an appeal to the benefits, the consequences that would come from that principle. Now you notice here that Mill is the very opposite of Hegel in ways which I'll expect you to explain to me later. The very opposite of Hegel. In the first place, there's no metaphysical jargon in this. That's why I'm able to lecture so freely. You don't have any problem understanding what he's saying. Hegel, we had to struggle with all of this jargon and these new concepts and so forth. Not Mill. Secondly, the whole orientation is different. Hegel asked about the true nature of the self's freedom. Okay, so Hegel's looking at the individual who is free, and he says, now, but what would be a more determinative and accurate notion of freedom? And through that, he develops the idea that the self is not autonomously free. Your true freedom is found where? In the state. So Hegel, if you will, is standing over against the unrestrained freedom of the individual and trying to show, no, you've got to have the state here if you're going to have genuine freedom. Mill, on the other hand, his orientation was quite the opposite. He wanted to know the justification and limits of the state restricting the individual's autonomy. Okay? So Hegel is looking at the individual and saying, don't think that's freedom. You've got to restrict the freedom of the individual by the state. Mill is looking at the state and saying, how do you justify the state restricting the individual's freedom? See, their orientation is completely different. That's because their worldview and their presuppositions are completely different. For Hegel, the true individual, remember what I told you in lecture, is the state. What you call individuals, private citizens, are only organs. They are never the individual. They're organs of the individual. The state is the body. For Mill, the true individual is not the state, not the whole, but the private citizen. That's the way you're accustomed to thinking. so he's the very opposite of Hegel. I don't need to tell you a whole lot more about utilitarianism. You understand the theory. Do your moral arithmetic. Weigh the pains and pleasures. Do that which brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. I don't need to explain it, but I am going to savagely criticize it. I have a lecture in our tape catalog some of you may want to get that illustrates this first criticism. When I went to Hillsdale College in Michigan, as you know, is the leading proponent of libertarian social theory and economics. One of the, I was going in to present Christian worldview and challenge. One of the lectures I gave was a critique of libertarianism. And my argument was that libertarianism can be turned against itself. I said, if you follow the principle that you're free to do anything except harm other people, then you don't end up with the free market, you end up with the socialist intrusive state. Now how could I do that? I mean, of course, the audience is just going, wait a minute, don't you understand what libertarianism? I certainly do. But if you have a secular principle of maximizing freedom, as long as you don't hurt other people, ask yourself, well, what hurts other people? Well, if I come into town and I open a hardware store in competition with you, and I do better than you, then I've hurt you, haven't I? And so that means the state should do a little bit of economic planning to make sure that everybody has a little bit of the business and not just those really, savage competitors, these capitalists. And so what looks like a freedom philosophy can be turned against itself. And those of you who've studied apologetics with me, that's what is known as an internal critique, a transcendental critique. You take the person from where he is and use his own philosophy to refute him, to turn him into the opposite of what he thinks he is. Well, given the organic connections within society, and I use the word organic purposely here to sound a little Hegelian, given the fact that there are organic connections within society, just about any action is going to have an impact for harm on others. We're so interlocked in our social relations that just about anything we do has an impact on other people, and often that impact can be interpreted broadly as harmful. Okay? I want to be free to leave Greenville at the end of this course and move on to Atlanta, present some lectures there. Hey, no problem. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not? What about the motel? If I move on to Atlanta, then they're going to have they have to have somebody else come in and take that room, or they're going to be losing money, aren't they? Now, there are other considerations that you might look at, but the fact of the matter is, every action, just about every action we take in society, has an effect on others, and it can be viewed as a negative effect. It doesn't look like I'm going out and getting a baseball bat and beating on people, harming them that way. That's what makes libertarianism look, convincing. But harm, how do you define harm? Haven't I harmed you if I've taken away trade from you and so forth? Of course I have. Now you aren't going to be able to feed your family if you don't go out and work harder to get somebody to be in my motel room. And thus a sincere and fully conscious application of the libertarian principle is likely to produce not fewer restrictions on liberty, but more restrictions on liberty. Look at the irony, the paradox there. A sincere application of the libertarian principle would produce more restrictions on liberty, not less. By sincere, I mean self-conscious, taking into account all the senses in which harm might be done to people. And so here you have the utilitarians refuted in that their individualism can actually lead to socialism on their own terms. Secondly, the utilitarians said that the legislator should do the moral arithmetic and tell us what the limits of our liberty are. But I have a question. Since Bentham held that all men are universal egoists, that's why he could be a utilitarian. He said, we compute the consequences because all men seek their own pleasure. And they avoid pain. That's true of all men. Well, if that's true of all men, isn't that true of the legislator too? He seeks his own pleasure. Well, if he seeks his own pleasure, then is he really being impartial and concerned with the general good? Or is he doing his calculation in a way that will make it come out to his benefit? What did we just learn from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche? There's something radically wrong inside here, right? Should we be trusting people that have some kind of radical off-centeredness in them, making our social decisions with this moral arithmetic? Neither Bentham or Mill took seriously the nature of the subject who was doing the legislation. Which, just as an aside, you all know that I promote a reconstructionist or theonomic approach to social decisions and legislation. That's why we look to God to make those decisions rather than human beings autonomously working them out on their own. We don't trust human beings to know what the limits of liberty are. Well, back to the lecture. Thirdly, utilitarianism can be criticized for its principle of maximizing pleasure. What does the word maximize mean here? You mean maximize the quantum of happiness or maximize the distribution of happiness? Utilitarianism can't answer that question on its own principles. Think about that. You know the difference between quantum and distribution, right? What if I were to have legislation that would bring just outrageously high levels of pleasure to everyone in this room, but would make everybody else in Greenville unhappy? But when you do the assessment, it turns out that you'd be so happy with my legislative plan that there would end up being more happiness in that scheme, even though some people are unhappy, more happiness quantity-wise, the quantum of pleasure, even though it was favorable to a real thin sliver of society, the students in my class. Is that what it means to maximize happiness? What's the greatest total pleasure points? Well, you know that isn't what most people think. They think that it's the greatest good for the greatest number, meaning it's got to be distributed pleasure. So that even if the total amount of pleasure points is lower, it'd be better to have legislation that gives a little bit of pleasure to everybody, rather than a lot of pleasure to a few. Yeah, but how do you know that? Which maximization program are we talking about here? Distribution or quantum? Fourthly, when Bentham and Mill tell us to compare pleasures and pains, I have a problem with this comparison notion. As a matter of fact, pleasure and pain are incommensurable both intrapersonally and interpersonally. I'll explain my words, but isn't that nice that you can get these things boiled down to just a few words like that? That is, pleasure and pain are incommensurable I-N-T-R-A, intrapersonally, and interpersonally, I-N-T-E-R. Intrapersonal, that is within the person, within myself, I'm saying pleasure and pain are incommensurable. How do I compare them? Now, you all know that I have certain medical conditions, and I'm not whining about that, but you've been made aware of that. I've had to talk about that. I don't particularly feel very good this morning. So should I be here on utilitarian principles giving this lecture? Well, on the other hand, as I think you can tell because I get animated in my lectures, I also love teaching. And I think philosophy has something to offer. And I also see it as a real great stepping stone for defending the faith and so forth. So I'm getting pleasure out of what I'm doing here, but it's hurting me too. Now, which is it? Do I get more pleasure than the pain that's being caused? Or is the pain greater than the pleasure that I'm getting from this lecture? Now, don't beg the question by saying, well, obviously the answer is you're getting more pleasure out of it because that's what you're doing, you're lecturing. No, the point is, how do you compare pain and pleasure within yourself? And how do you measure it so that you can compare it? It's kind of like, well, yeah, I've got 3 pain points this morning, but 10 pleasure points, and so what on earth is that? Now, if it's hard enough to measure pain and pleasure intrapersonally, within myself, just think about the difficulty, how do I compare it interpersonally? My pleasures and pains over against your pleasures and pains. Because notice I talked about the pleasure of giving this lecture even though I'm not feeling real good. Well, how are you feeling as you sit there taking this lecture and your hands are cramping up because you're writing so much and your brains are about ready to burst because I'm saying all these big words and so forth? You may be hurting a great deal. And so maybe I shouldn't be giving this lecture. For all the pleasure it gives me, maybe it's giving you more pain. How do I know? Don't beg the question by saying, well, you know that we're getting enough pleasure out of this because we're sitting here, Dr. Bahnsen. I mean, I'd give you an A if you said that, but
Go home now.
Yeah, right. Get out of here. We got better things to do. We want to sleep in today, whatever. Now, we all know that life is full of these, you have to make assessments and you get a net conclusion in terms of your decisions and all that. But how do you do this by way of comparison? How do I compare my pleasures to your pains? Okay, the Marquis de Sade got a great deal of pleasure out of torturing women. Now, there's no doubt that the women didn't enjoy that, unless they were masochists. Well, that raises a whole another complication now. What if there's people that enjoy pain? Okay, it's like the masochist who said to the sadist, hurt me, and so he didn't. Because he was a sadist, he wasn't going to give pleasure to this person by pain. This gets really complicated. Marquis de Sade gets pleasure out of torturing women. Women allegedly don't enjoy that, but maybe his pleasure points are higher than their pain points. Now, I know you all have an opinion on that subject. I do too. But by the way, mine comes from divine revelation. I couldn't possibly, I might fool myself, be deceiving of myself here. I couldn't possibly claim to rationally know that. How would you know that? Yes, I know that this woman's in pain. I know that this man is really reaching a level of ecstasy. How do I know what the comparison is between those two? So you see, utilitarianism is not just unworkable on its maximization notion, its notion of comparing is unworkable too. And I got another criticism, the whole notion of future consequences. You should choose that action or that legislation that is going to bring in the future the greatest happiness to the greatest number. Well, what do you mean by future consequences? How wide are the consequences that we're supposed to consider? How wide, how relevant is the scope of what we're exploring? We tend to understand utilitarianism because we keep our mind on just one aspect. We say, okay, prison reform is going to have these consequences for prisoners, these consequences for guards, these consequences for judges, so forth. Well, what if prison reform means putting a new prison in my backyard? I don't know if you face this elsewhere in the country, but in California, we go through the throes of this all the time. We need more prisons badly, from the secular standpoint. We need more prisons, but no one wants prisons in their neighborhood. We've got people living in so many places. Where are you going to put these prisons? Well, no, so that may be something that the prison reform people didn't take into account. Did they take into account the economic consequences of having to buy the land to put the prison here, and no one else wants to come in for generations now and to build grocery stores near the prison? Well, they probably didn't. But now what you're thinking is, well, okay, we didn't think of that. We should. Okay, good. Well, but how far does it go? How many other consequences do we have to consider? Do we have to consider when now that's going to stifle business activity in this area? And it's also going to stifle the building of public schools near the prison, and yet you need guards and wardens and so forth living there to man the prison. So now where are their kids going to be educated? And what are the effects of busing their kids to the schools that are further away? And what if those kids, because they are bused, don't get socialized properly? I'm following secular mentality here about schools, and they turn into juvenile delinquents and get on drugs, and then the drug culture is encouraged. I'm going to stop here. You've gotten the point, right? Well, how wide of consequences are you supposed to consider? And how long, how extended are the consequences? Can any utilitarian, we've already shown that utilitarians can't make sense of maximizing, can't make sense of comparing, but now, can any utilitarian calculate the consequences for 3 years' worth of prison reform? I'd say no, they can't. But even if they could they extend that to 5, 50, 500? Somebody says, oh, well, you don't have to do it. Why not? Aren't you being arbitrary? If you're going to look at consequences, at what point do you stop your consideration of consequences? This is a serious criticism. You told me consequences determine the rightness or wrongness of this. Well, what do you mean by consequences? Consequences 3 millennia from now? 3 years from now? 3 minutes from now? What are you referring to? There's another problem, and this one Mill tried to address, and that's the problem that not all pleasures seem to be equal. Mill's essay entitled Utilitarianism, published in 1863, tried to improve on Bentham's quantitative approach to pleasure. Bentham said, you just look at the quantity of pleasure. How much pleasure is given? Well, we've already seen, but we don't know whether that quantity is to be considered by distribution as well. But there's a bigger problem. Are all pleasures of the same sort? Are they all equal? Let's consider a pig and Socrates, as the old attack on this view would go. Mill himself dealt with this. Is a satisfied pig better than a dissatisfied Socrates, or vice versa? Well, English opinion in that day, and probably even in our own day, we may have some Nietzscheans who will philosophize with a hammer and say, go with the pig, by all means. We have a lot of piggish hedonists in our culture, but even in our culture, most people would say, better to be a Socrates in prison than a satisfied pig in the sty. Well, but on utilitarian principles, how can that be? Because maybe the pig has more satisfaction and pleasure than poor Socrates, who is hurting and is going to drink the hemlock. But he was a philosopher. And so we tend to think the pleasures of the mind are superior, morally better, than the pleasures of the body. And on this, I'll sound like a walking commercial today. In our tape catalog, I have a lecture entitled, Can Utilitarianism Be Saved from the Swine Trough? Well, I guess you know my answer. I don't think it can be. Here's what John Stuart Mill did. He said, we have to take consideration of the quality of pleasure, not just the quantity of pleasure. And in so doing, John Stuart Mill, without even realizing, contradicted his own philosophy. Do you see that? Quality of pleasure as a consideration for a utilitarianist is a renunciation of utilitarian principles. What could it possibly mean to talk about the quality of pleasure? Well, if you hold to the hedonistic foundation of utilitarianism, quality of pleasure can only mean the more pleasurable pleasures, which makes it all the more piggish as a philosophy. But if you don't mean the most pleasurable of pleasures, then you must be introducing something beyond pleasure by which you evaluate the moral superiority of a Socrates to a pig. And so if pleasure and pain are the only factors in utilitarianism, Mill was actually contradicting utilitarianism when he introduced consideration of quality. Further criticism. Even if pleasure is the only thing men do desire in fact, it doesn't logically follow that pleasure is our only value. That is, it doesn't follow that men ought to pursue pleasure. The utilitarians committed what is called the naturalistic fallacy in ethics, that what is the case ought to be the case. So they would argue the reason why we have to consider pleasure in our moral arithmetic is because all men seek pleasure. Well, yeah, but the underlying philosophical question is, ought all men to seek pleasure? That pleasure is a fact, or the seeking of pleasure is a fact, does not mean that it's a value. Maybe we should teach people not to seek pleasure. Maybe. Utilitarians just made a tremendous philosophical mistake at this point. And then there's a further difficulty. Why am I obligated to seek the maximization of happiness for the greatest number of people? Why am I obligated to seek the pleasure of society as a whole rather than just my own? That is, utilitarianism has as a competitor egoism that says I should make my decisions based on what makes me happy, not what other people are happy with. How can the utilitarians prove that even if we are to seek pleasure, see, they start by saying all men seek pleasure. I said, well, that doesn't mean that they ought to. But even if they ought to seek pleasure, it's another step to say they ought to seek the pleasures of others. Why should I be concerned with society as a whole? On utilitarian principles, I don't see how you could possibly defend that. You'd have to introduce another value, like the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Be altruistic, care for other people. Well, that's not a utilitarian principle in and of itself. So how is it justified? And I'll conclude then with, I've really hammered these people, but I need to because this is the spirit of our age, isn't it? I'll conclude with this criticism. The utilitarian belief in a simple empiricism as the ideal for all knowledge, the belief in a simple empiricism as the ideal for all knowledge, that is the plan to reorganize all aspects of life and put them on a rational basis, is naive. It is dangerous, and it creates nothing more but pseudoscience. Moral arithmetic, give me a break. In the nature of the case, morality, which is value-oriented, cannot be quantified into an arithmetic. But what I'm saying is this approach of the utilitarians is naive. I hope I've shown you that in my criticisms. It's dangerous, and it creates pseudoscience. Let me just look at the danger of it, and we'll move on. If I'm a utilitarian, let's imagine that as the head of the police force, I have a community that's been terrorized by a rapist, and we haven't been able to catch the rapist. Now, the rapist is not doing a lot of damage. Obviously, the women that get raped, we have to feel badly about that. But in terms of overall assessment, it's not like the rapist has 90% of the women who are being defiled. But there are some women who are being defiled. But now the defiling of a few women is creating in society, what? A generalized panic, uneasiness. And that is creating difficulty among neighbors and relationship with the police and so forth. So now I'm a utilitarian. How do I approach this? Let me give you a legitimate utilitarian approach. Society is being hurt in the general sense. I'm not talking about the individual women who get raped, but society in general is being hurt by the fact that we don't have a suspect. And so what I will do is that I will find somebody who is not liked by anybody else in society, has no family, is a loner, has bad breath, can't keep a job, And we have individuals like that in our society. We have to do a little bit of research. Let's say we identify something like that, and what we do is we haul him in on trumped-up charges and evidence, and now what we can put on the evening news is the rapist has been found. We're prosecuting him. Sleep well at night. Take it easy. You women go back to the malls. Don't worry about it. Why not? Well, you say, well, Dr. Bahnsen, that's counterintuitive as to what we mean by justice. It's not right to accuse a man that's innocent. I say, right? What's right? The only thing that's right is what maximizes pleasure for everybody. Somebody say, oh yeah, well, what if this rapist rapes again? Well, then we'll tell people there's another rapist. And we'll do this again. We'll get another innocent person, and people will rest assured that they're all right. Now, it may be true that you can't do that over and over again. You could, rewrite my story so that becomes counterproductive to do it. But just in terms of the phase of the story that I've told you, utilitarians can't stand up and say, don't accuse an innocent man like that. If it would be for the good of society, the individual can be sacrificed. That's why I maintain that utilitarianism is dangerous. It not only leads to socialism ultimately, but it also leads to the injustice of how you treat individuals in society. They can all be sacrificed for the public good. All right, that's all I have to say about the first secular school of thought in the 19th century. Do you want to ask any questions? I hope none of you find any credibility in this. I've taken a little more time than I usually do to criticize because I really find this a deplorable philosophy, and it needs to be, I think, severely put down. Yes?
I've had to deal with libertarians myself in the past, and they reacted pretty bitterly against the things I said. If you were in Michigan dealing with libertarians there, how did they react to it?
They were overwhelmed with shock that anybody would dare speak against libertarianism on the hallowed grounds of Hillsdale College. That's okay. Well, and they tried to give considerations that would rescue utilitarianism or libertarianism, pardon me, from the kinds of arguments that I have here, but I don't think anybody had anything adequate. What happens, I'm now giving you a broader view of human nature and philosophy and debate. As a social reality, and in this regard, you have to appreciate Nietzsche's insights. Philosophers tend to be hired guns. They're attorneys for a preconceived opinion. So when you have somebody come in who really rocks your philosophy and does it from within your own philosophy, now, maybe I didn't accomplish that. You listen to the lecture, decide for yourself. But if I did that doesn't mean people are going to stand up in the audience and say, I just want to confess my sins. I'm turning from libertarianism. You have convinced me. No, there's something wrong with human nature. If I can appeal now to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in that regard, we're off-center. And we have this will to power. And so what happens is, libertarians who have been refuted, what they do is they sneer at you. They say, oh, what do you know? And they go back and they tell their students, this guy, here's how we'd answer this, here's how we'd answer that. But all of it is just an expression of what? Their will to power. They're going to rationalize and try to hold on to what they have. Okay, we really have a lot more to get onto, so if you have questions quickly or observations. Did I say hand? Go ahead, real quick.
Well, I was just going to say, on your point number 9, you used your analogy of getting us to imagine the thing that you told us. If you're utilitarian, then you say back to say that we shouldn't imagine that because it might not be pleasurable for all of us, and therefore we might not really want to listen to your speech.
I've lost you somehow.
In other words, you want us to sit and imagine
Yes.
your whole setup.
Yes.
The town and the rapists and the trouble and have that setup. But if you're a utilitarian, can you say, well, is it going to be flexible for the most amount of people?
And the answer is it will, because people get pleasure out of holding to true theories rather than false ones. and so they will be happy in the end to have had utilitarianism refuted. You want to go another round with this? I mean, I can play this game, but you see what we're doing here? It's all a question of your presuppositions, isn't it? What orients you to what is pleasurable? You know, what kind of calculation do you do in moral assessments and so forth? Well, let's move on. In your outline for the course, I believe that the next entry is titled Materialism, Positivism, and Evolutionary Naturalism.